Lowies just wanted to have dinner like any other person. But the waitress didn't see it that way. To her, he was worth nothing. She mocked him, humiliated him, and made him cry in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that this boy had a powerful father, and that his revenge would be relentless. The protagonist of this shameful episode was Sophie Marchand, a waitress with over 3 years of experience at the establishment, whose unacceptable behavior has sparked a wave of outrage on social media and in the press. The victim, a young Afro-descendant with Down syndrome named Louis, had simply gone to the restaurant to enjoy a meal, never imagining what was about to happen. Eyewitnesses report that from a moment Louis entered the establishment with his caregiver, Sophie showed clear signs of discomfort. Her face tensed, and her attitude became impatient. "I thought she was just having a bad day," said an anonymous customer. "But when she started talking, we realized what was really going on." According to accounts, the waitress avoided approaching their table for several minutes until finally, with a look of disdain, she reluctantly attended to them. "Are you sure you want to eat here?" Sophie asked dryly, looking Louis up and down. The caregiver, surprised, responded kindly. "Of course. He loves French food." Sophie sighed, rolled her eyes, and pulled out her notepad. However, instead of taking their order professionally, she did so in a condescending manner. "Look, this is an upscale restaurant. I'm not sure he'll understand the menu," she said, emphasizing the last word while casting a mocking glance at Louis. The young man, who had been smiling until then, began to notice the hostility in her voice. Remaining calm, he pointed at the dish he wanted, a coq au vin, and ordered it clearly. But Sophie let out a sarcastic laugh. "That's a complicated dish. Maybe it'd be better if you ordered something simpler, like a burger," she said patronizingly. The tension at the table became palpable. Other customers, who had been enjoying their evening without paying much attention, began to notice what was happening. Louis's caregiver leaned toward him and took his hand, trying to reassure him, but the young man was clearly affected. "I want coq au vin," he repeated firmly. Sophie clicked her tongue. "All right, but don't blame me if you don't like it." She turned abruptly and walked toward the kitchen, not bothering to hide her annoyance. But the humiliation didn't stop there. As Sophie walked away, she muttered something under her breath that several nearby customers managed to hear. "I don't know why they let certain kinds of people in here," she murmured with barely concealed disdain. Some diners exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to intervene. At the table, Louis's caregiver tried to distract him by talking about other things, but the young man was visibly uneasy. However, the real blow was yet to come. When Sophie returned with the drinks, she carelessly set Louis's glass of water down, splashing him slightly. "Oops, sorry," she said, without a hint of remorse. "Maybe I shouldn't have given you a glass one. Huh? I should have brought a plastic cup, like the ones used in kindergartens." Louis lowered his gaze, feeling ashamed. He clenched his hands on his lap and tried to ignore her, but Sophie wasn't done with her cruel game. "Tell me, do you know how to use cutlery?" she asked with a twisted smile. "If you want, I can ask the chef to mash your food like baby puree. It'd be easier for you." Her words were like a dagger. Louis, who had tried to stay strong, began to tremble slightly. His large, expressive eyes glistened with a mix of shame and sadness. His caregiver immediately hugged him, shooting Sophie a furious glare. "That's enough," she exclaimed. "You're being incredibly disrespectful." Sophie just shrugged as if she found the situation amusing. "I'm sorry, I'm just trying to help. I don't want him making a mess and embarrassing us in front of the other customers." Louis couldn't take it anymore. His lips quivered, and within seconds, thick tears began rolling down his cheeks. He lowered his head and sobbed silently, trying to hold back. Some customers who had witnessed the scene began murmuring among themselves, outraged. "Is she really talking like that?" whispered a woman. "This is unacceptable." But Sophie simply crossed her arms and smirked smugly. "See, that's why I say this isn't a place for him. People like him don't know how to behave in places like this." His caregiver, furious, stood up abruptly, ready to take Louis out of there. But at that very moment, an imposing figure appeared at the restaurant entrance. And as soon as his eyes fell on the scene, all the color drained from Sophie's face. The man who had just entered the restaurant was tall, elegant, dressed in an impeccable suit, and carried an air of authority that immediately commanded respect. His gaze swept across the restaurant until it landed on the table where Louis was sobbing, his face soaked in tears. A heavy silence filled the air as some customers recognized the newcomer. Sophie, noticing the murmurs around her, turned with an irritated expression. "Now what?" she scoffed, but the moment her eyes met the man's, her expression changed completely. Her arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by a mix of confusion and fear. The man walked with firm steps toward Louis's table. His caregiver, upon seeing him, immediately stood up and took his hand with visible relief. "Mr. Moreau," she whispered, trying to compose herself. Louis, still sobbing, looked up and extended his arms. The man wasted no time in bending down to embrace him tightly, stroking his hair with tenderness. "I'm here, son," he murmured in a deep but affectionate voice. "Everything's okay." That was when Sophie felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Son." That word echoed in her head like a warning bell. Her breathing quickened, and her mind refused to accept the reality. No, it can't be," she stammered, feeling panic take over her. Some customers watched the scene with a mix of anticipation and tension. They knew exactly who that man was, Jean Moreau, the renowned chef and owner of Le Soleil, the man who had turned that restaurant into one of the most prestigious in the city. And she had just humiliated his son. Jean Moreau slowly straightened up, still resting a hand on Louis's shoulder. His gaze, cold as steel, settled on Sophie. "Tell me," his voice was low but filled with danger, "is what I just heard true?" Sophie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat went dry, and her heart pounded wildly. She tried to force a nervous smile, but her lips only trembled. "Mr. Moreau, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" he repeated icily. "Because what I heard was one of my employees humiliating my son, making him cry, treating him as if he didn't deserve to be here. Is that a misunderstanding?" The tone of his voice made Sophie instinctively step back. I didn't know he was your son." Jean Moreau let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, really? And does that make it any less cruel? Any less despicable?" Sophie clutched her apron, feeling sweat gather at the nape of her neck. "Sir, I was just concerned about the restaurant's image. You know, certain kinds of people." She trailed off immediately as she noticed how Jean's expression darkened even more. "Certain kinds of people?" he repeated in a chilling whisper. The entire restaurant was dead silent. No one dared to move. Louis's caregiver simply held him, trying to soothe him while watching Jean expectantly. The restaurant owner took a deep breath and then, with slow and deliberate movements, unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves. "All right," he said in a low voice. "Let's deal with this properly." Sophie swallowed hard, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Jean Moreau never took his eyes off Sophie. His expression was that of a man who had just witnessed the unforgivable. He took a breath, stepped even closer to her, and spoke with a calmness that was far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Sophie, since the day I opened this restaurant, I have always demanded professionalism, respect, and excellence. But what you did tonight," his voice hardened, "is inexcusable." Sophie felt her legs weaken. "Mr. Moreau, please, it wasn't my intention." "Not your intention?" He cut her off. "You humiliated my son, made him cry in front of everyone, and mocked him as if his life was worth less than yours." Jean turned toward Louis's caregiver. "Tell me, was that all she did?" The woman, her face still red with indignation, shook her head. "No, sir. From the moment we arrived, she made us feel unwelcome. She mocked Louis, implied he couldn't understand the menu, and treated him as if he were inferior." Jean closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to contain an immeasurable rage. Then he exhaled and pointed directly at Sophie. "You're fired." Immediately, Sophie felt a cold chill run down her spine. "No, please," she begged, gripping her apron as if it could save her. "Mr. Moreau, this job is all I have. It was a mistake. I didn't know he was your son." Jean let out a bitter laugh. "And if he hadn't been?" Would that make it any less serious? I'm not firing you because you insulted my son. I'm firing you because I don't want people like you in my restaurant. The customers began murmuring among themselves, some even nodding in approval. A man at a nearby table tapped his glass lightly. "Well said, chef." Sophie felt the air leave her lungs. She looked around for support, but all she found were disapproving stares. "Please, Mr. Moreau, I need this job." Jean crossed his arms. "You know what my son needs? Respect. Something you didn't even try to give him. Now, gather your things and leave." A deafening silence fell over the restaurant. Sophie felt a lump in her throat, but there was nothing left to do. With her face pale and her hands trembling, she removed her apron and placed it on the counter. Then, without another word, she walked out of the restaurant with her head down, feeling the weight of the stairs on her back. As the door closed behind her, Jean turned his attention back to Louis, who still had tearful eyes but now looked at him with a small smile. "You know what, champ?" Jean said, kneeling down to his level. "From now on, you can come here whenever you want. This restaurant is as much yours as it is mine." Louis hugged him tightly. "Can I have cocoa vin?" Jean laughed and kissed his son's forehead. "You can have whatever you want. And this time, I'll make it myself." The customers erupted into applause, some even standing to show their support. Louis grinned widely, happy to know that his father would always be there to protect him. Days later, Sophie walked through the streets of Paris, her clothes wrinkled and her eyes red from crying. She had tried to find work at other restaurants, but in the culinary world, news of her disgraceful firing had spread like wildfire. No one wanted to hire a waitress with a history of discrimination. She stopped in front of Le Soleil, gazing through the window. Inside, she saw Jean Moreau personally serving a dish to Louis, who laughed as his father told him something amusing. A sharp pang of regret hit her chest. She realized that her hatred and arrogance had cost her everything. If only she had treated Louis with respect from the start. But it was too late. Thank you for reading until the end. If this story made you reflect, don't miss the next one I recommend. It offers another important perspective on understanding and combating discrimination. Click now, and let's keep the conversation going.